Beginning of turn one, next game here in 2018. Once again, playing via FaceTime between our home bases in Michigan and Texas. And we have the initial setup of the board. Playing this game under the same house rules as the prior game, which are the Omega 2.4 version of the abandoned monitoring station house rules. So here's to another interesting game. It is halfway through turn one, and we've decided to take a couple different strategies this time around. So Japan has mostly followed the same script, but we've modified, learned some lessons from prior games. We've struck out, for example, and taken Soviet Far East, made an investment into taking some mainland Russia their first turn. Built this time 2 transports instead of 3, along with a tank and a sub, to have some more presence in the Pacific. Most of the fleet now has gone down to the Carolines, where we have just created a number of more options for ourselves in the Pacific. That includes 2 strat bombers, by the way. Full complement of naval units, while the remaining Navy, much smaller than it usually looks, down here in Sea Zone 36 is hanging out off the coast. Now, mind you, there is still a crap ton of Japanese Air Force in Guangxi, and we're making our standard push into the rest of China. So we're basically taking the same, more or less the same playbook, and just reorienting some stuff to give us a better set of options here on turn 2. In the meantime, Germany has taken another crack at a strategy I've tried in the past, but in a slightly different execution, and that is Russia first, and then just piling into Russia on G1. So last game we played, Germany didn't go in. I think they went in G2, maybe G3 it was. I think it was actually G3, and then they built a factory down in Romania, but that wasn't until turn 2. So much harder push this time into Russia by going in there turn 1 into eastern Poland, building a military base and dozy-doing the guys from Greater Southern into Romania. Really put as much on that eastern front as quickly as possible as we can. In Paris, I think actually something similar may have happened last time, to come to think of it. But the way that I've divided up the forces meant that I had only 4 tanks left in Paris at the end of the day. Largely because we had some really, really poor rolls there at the beginning. So that's a point of concern. Certainly not one that makes me happy. So the battleship is all that lived there, and it's damaged. Over in the Atlantic, the sub pot shots, the one in Canada failed, but the one in 91 actually worked this time and took out that cruiser there. So that's a little bit of an assist for Italy, and that may be the last assist they get directly for a while. Other than, of course, we've got the backup in Southern, and we're gonna not follow the same script necessarily as prior games where this strategy didn't work out as well. Kind of learned some of those lessons. We did build a destroyer up here in 113 to bolster that Navy. And Russia, in keeping with the whole red tide philosophy that Chris has picked up lately from Gargantua and others, bought for Russia not any infantry at all, rather, but 6 tanks. 6 tanks with its initial build. So that is a quite heavy offensive force, half of those in Ukraine, half of those in Novgorod, with pulling back several of the forces here to create a second strike capability. We'll see how the rest of the allies play it out on the rest of turn 1. We've reached the beginning of turn 2. The allies have changed it up a little bit this time. You'll see that the U.S. switching it up and building everything, and I do mean everything, in the Pacific this time around, consolidating it with the Hawaiian fleet there in San Francisco, so that now we've we've got an equal and opposite force reacting to the Japanese. Power shift in the Pacific here, power projection. The Anzacians doing what little it is that they can do, while the Calcutta fleet is all gravitating towards the Middle East here. You'll see that everything that could move out of Java, or rather Malaya, Shan State, everything's moving left. Even some of the Anzac units in a plane flying over into Malaya, reinforcing India that way, so that the actual Indians can move here into the Middle East and buttress what is obviously an attempt to get that Middle East bonus here pretty quickly. In the Mediterranean, as one would have laid very good money on, the London British performed a Taranto raid that went remarkably well for them, landing all those planes there in Malta. The lack of a cruiser coming in from Sea Zone 91 certainly played a role here, leaving just this transport for the British, and they barely took out the Italian Navy that was there, giving me the opportunity to pick up a couple guys and extricate them from Libya before they get squished here pretty soon. Pulling off a convoy here in Italy here while the Navy still exists. Italy getting its bonus with Greece, Southern, and Gibraltar, as I'm typically want to do, but stretched so thin in getting everything that they wanted to get that opted to leave Yugoslavia open until next turn. All of which parallels developments we've seen before when pursuing this Russia crush strategy, with the exception of lack of U.S. and backup, and British doing a little bit different here. So we'll see what this combination of moves means for round two. Now halfway through turn two, Japan's just taken its move and has opted basically not to make a move, not pouncing on any of the allies just yet, but rather incrementally spreading out its triangle of doom here, a little bit into China, a little bit this way in a move that's probably never been seen before on this board, at least in our games, with a turn two Japanese invasion of the New Hebrides Islands for undisclosed reasons. That being a French island doesn't trigger the other allies to get into the war. It's like one territory in that area that the Japanese can actually move on. Otherwise, no huge moves into China, only because, as a consequence of my earlier move, the Chinese have been able to build up a stack there that is just too big to take down with planes alone. The leapfrog move that I've employed in the past just wouldn't cut it this time around. So we're biding our time, as it were, in China to see which way he's going to go with that. In the meantime, on the European side of the board, the Germans feel a little bit better about themselves, at least this time around. Kind of completed the move that they began in the first turn to clean out those lines. So, for example, on the Western Front, we finally purged all of the remaining allies, and we didn't call this out last time, but you may have seen that the French, as I think they've done in a game or two in the past, took advantage of that lone tack bomber up there in Holland to invade Holland for the sake of France and take that away from Germany. Certainly to get routed again, but at what cost? There was a whole lot of German tanks and a tack bomber that had to be dedicated to flushing the French out of Holland rather than doing more productive things. Now, also down here, you'll see that the counterattack on Taranto was successful, but boy, again, super high cost. Every one of those 3 British naval units hit, taking out 3 German planes with them. So, as Chris said, that is probably the most successful Taranto raid in our history, at least in recent recollection. So the Med's clear. Italy's got its bonuses, at least for the time being, but it's hampered. It also had a bloody battle going into Greece, as you see here, with only one tank left from last turn. Wasn't even able to take Yugoslavia yet here halfway through turn 2, and Yugoslavia is still independent. So those are never good things. But at least the Germans have something to feel good about. They've got a nice little stack down here in Romania. Even bigger stack up here in the Baltics with mech infantries coming up behind. Built a couple bombers so far, one each turn, so they got that support. Russians seeing the writing on the wall, having vacated Leningrad, pulled back to build up their second strike capacity with another unit that is not often seen. That is a Russian Strat bomber joining the rest of the Air Force there back in Russia. So how will the rest of the Allies capitalize on this situation in the remainder of turn 2? Beginning of turn 3, we see how the Allies have reacted. We have an enormous conflagration of Americans here in Hawaii, having brought the entire fleet down from San Francisco, even building some transports and land units to back that up. We'll see a little bit of Atlantic build starting, but right now we've got a huge position of guys here in the Hawaiian Sea Zone. Anzac has actually reached out a little bit, kind of made one last gasp, more of a curtain than a wall, but taking what Navy it has and throwing it out there as sacrificial lambs while pulling everything else back to Sydney. On the Calcutta side, we see some similar defensive maneuvering here, everybody gathering towards India, at least the land units, because the air and sea units are busy over here helping their European brethren conquer the Middle East and attain the bonus that goes with that. Africa, where we see a serious concentration on building up and creating a power base here in Africa, going after that Africa victory token. So we've built all of Europe's builds are here in Africa and the Middle East. We see 2 tanks in South Africa. We see a military base in Egypt is what that piece is, as well as a minor factory in Persia. So whether you want to call that the Middle Earth strategy or not, that is certainly a focus, making the power base for all of the UK economies, both of them together there solidly in the middle of the Levant right there. So that's the focus there, even to the extent that we've pretty much vacated London. All of the air units have left it. We've just got a token placeholder force there. They've all come down to Morocco here, where the Navy has taken out Gibraltar in a bold move that kicked the Italians out of there, cost them a 5 IPC bonus. That was painful. And a build up here all around the African ring, but Italy taking advantage of the opportunity to build up a transport again. So it lost a transport in 92, as it would have expected, but pulled its Navy and Air Force back together and actually has a little nub of a Navy growing up there, as well as finally clearing out Yugoslavia. So with this setup, and you'll see, as I mentioned, the American carrier there now making an appearance in the Atlantic. What will be the game plan on turn 3? Halfway now through turn 3, and Japan has not done what Chris wanted me to do, which was commit to a particular theater of war, at least not any more than I previously had, opting to rather reinforce the triangle of doom here by building a 4th carrier in Sea Zone 6, more transports, kind of beefing up or playing with the Navy on each corner of the triangle, pulling this transport back here a little bit. Over here we've got sub and a destroyer kind of out on the periphery. Here is potential options there, but otherwise holding fast on the navies and piling hard into Yunnan, hopefully to hold on to the Burma Road this time, and building the airstrip this time in Hunan rather than Guangxi. There are reasons for that, but this time we mixed it up a little bit. The Russians have not gotten as adventurous as they threatened to. They, for some reason, we have yet to discern, pulled the Strat bomber that Russia built last turn into Amur to join this stack of infantry. Sent a couple over here to take out the infantry that was gobbling up the Far East, and got that IPC back, but so far haven't taken the plunge into Manchuria, just threatening to do so. And now with a bomber that has a longer range to it, you know, Japan's got to be cognizant of all that it can do, so and prepare for it as I've done. The Navy and Carolines here got beefed up some with the transports and sub from C-Zone 6. We've got more land units available to us now down there. Again, not committing to anything yet with those units, but continuing to project power with them, which is exactly what they want to be doing right now. On the European side of the board, the European Axis are so far feeling good. This is one of those turns that early in the game that, you know, the Axis feel great about what they're doing until they run to a brick wall, lose steam, and the Allies get resurgent. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time around. But, you know, Germany pushing forward, having taken the Novgorod territory that Russia basically ceded to it, and now Russia pulling back again from the front, leaving another buffer zone, and beginning a more traditional infantry stack in Russia. That's 28 infantry, 28 infantry. Got some mechs, some tanks, some artillery, the whole works. There in Russia, surrounded by a buffer zone of infantry. With its one remaining bonus of not having any allies on its territory, Russia is still getting 31 this turn, 31 IPCs. So with that much territory gone, that's still a lot of IPCs for Russia to be getting. So, you know, in this game, I think if things keep going the way they are and Germany still can't take Russia, I think that means something's wrong with our house rules, to be honest. But that's where we're at now. We'll see what the Allies choose to do in the rest of turn 3. Now at the beginning of turn 4, the U.S. has committed to its strategy, and that includes moving just about everything up to C-Zone 7 here, and building a naval base up in Alaska to fully commit itself to the Pacific theater, giving Japan plenty to handle. Shooting one destroyer down here at 49 just to cover the bases for Anzac so that it was freed up to kill off that Japanese transport. So much for that move. Everybody declaring war down here, beginning with the U.S.'s turn so that they can collect their wartime bonuses. Thus positioning my Japanese forces to convoy here. Anzac getting a little heady, taking Sumatra in addition to its bonuses for a IPC total of 25, which is just way too much. In India, we're starting to build offensive units because, okay, this move right here, see, this has been a depressing half turn for the Axis because they just had a couple rolls that should not have happened the way they did. The Axis dice have just been frozen the rest of this turn. China threw everything it had into Yunnan just to slow down the advance of the Japanese forces. Ended up destroying them with plenty left over. That were the 98-something% odds for the Japanese prevail in that victory, that battle, and they did super, super poorly. So now Japan has got its claws chopped off here in China. Still plenty of planes, but it's really deprived of the ground forces that it once had, and that's depressing. Meanwhile, UK continues to push its advance into the Middle East. Really kind of masterful positioning by Chris here in the UK to put this huge navy here, as well as an enormous buildup of air force in Malta with an airstrip to boot, allowing it to project itself and just utterly eliminate anything that that Italy really could have built there navally. So Italy taking the next best move it could come up with, which is taking Gibraltar to secure that bonus, kind of reorienting itself defensively here in Europe, and buying 2 Strat bombers to get some offensive capability that he can't utterly wipe out the next turn. So that's all well and good, except for the 4 land units and cruiser shot and bomber had a 90-something, really high percent chance of victory here in Gibraltar, and again rolled exceedingly poorly to the point where I actually had to take a hit on the bomber in order to secure that space. Really depressing. Chris is laughing, but just one of those moves that really slows you down and knocks the wind out of your sails. Of course, there aren't any sails being cast here in the Atlantic. All the action is on the land, and we'll see if the Axis can't get its groove back in turn 4. Halfway through turn 4, and Japan's done exactly what it needed to do, which is, unfortunately, the thing that resulted in it getting the fewest bonuses possible. And that's drawing just about all of its navy back to Sea Zone 6 to successfully flush out the Russians from Korea and Manchuria and stave off, with any luck, the invading U.S. force. I'd be shocked if he did anything other than retreat with those and regroup, but that's it's okay. That's what he planned on doing, because it required me to retrench all of that navy, collapse the Triangle of Doom into a single point of destruction, and thus vastly reducing my ability to project power. Anzac and certainly Calcutta, I think, anticipated that last turn with not building much at all in the way of defensive units here in the sea zone, and preparing for what the U.S. is going to make Japan do. So Japan trying to hold on to what it could. For one thing, it's got a base in the Carolines still, and was able to use its planes and subs to take out the destroyers that were nearby anyway. Had the opportunity, I mean, could have easily gone into Hawaii, but that would have left Russians in Korea. And that stack of 12 units over there, which I don't suppose we mentioned that in the prior video, hadn't happened yet. That's what happened in the first turn. They plunged those Russians into Korea, 12 of them, and the 2 AA guns, and some 3 more in Manchuria. So Japan couldn't let that fester, couldn't let that stack sit there. Even if the Russians didn't go marauding through China, which they may very well have done, it would have been a impenetrable stack once the Americans started landing planes there. So it was now or never to flush those guys out and reduce that threat on that flank. So I had to suck it up and retrench my navy, and had to pull it all back, because if I pull anything less than all of it back, it thus becomes susceptible to attack by the Americans, and can't have that, especially when there's a stack of 6 transports there, everything I've been investing in the whole game. So had to protect that, but now I've got quite a large nub of units there that I can start projecting out from again. Japan's only getting 31 this turn. That's way too little for them to be getting on turn 4, but hopefully we'll make up for that. I mean, that's what we got to do when, they've already chopped off my offensive units here in China. So we didn't even push back on that front this time, rather just piling up enough defensive units to withstand Chinese attack, even giving up on taking Hong Kong, just to preserve that, because that is just not something that can be lost. Putting a military base in there as well, so we finally got some on board, on land unit production ability. The rest of Russia's turn, they spent completely turtling, although taking back Smolensk and Bryansk, which are 2 of the 3 territories that Germany took on this front. The little attrition of infantry there is starting to get expensive and not work out so well for on the German side, because that's a stack of 36, 34 or so, 34 infantry in addition to the rest. So that's not something we can mess with. We can't let them continue to pick off German units. But the line has moved forward. All that stack moved into the Ukraine, degrading the factory there into a military base. Russia just holding the line there, while Germany continued to build both bombers and some planes to support them, upgraded the factory in Novgorod to increase its production ability and move the whole stack forward, while building up a little nub of a navy over here in 112 as well. So that's how the first half of turn 4 went. How will those allies react on the rest of turn 4? Beginning of turn 5, and the allies have definitely captured a large amount of momentum. So, as surprises no one, the allies here, the American fleet that was in 7 pulls back to Sea Zone 1, having launched all their planes into where? Well, you know, where they always go, you know, that air base in Yakut SSR, obviously. Those 6 U.S. planes, of course, on their way to Moscow by means of the airstrip that Russia built in Yakut at the beginning of the turn in anticipation of exactly that move. So the Anzacs, taking advantage of Japan's absence from the Southern Pacific, now getting aggressive, building up a fleet. You see their first aircraft carrier down there at the bottom, collecting way too much money with all their bonuses intact and occupying Sumatra. Likewise, the Calcuttans getting aggressive, having built tanks and moving all of their stack into Burma, getting ready to plunge into China. China having launched from Yunnan into Queichow, really starting to eat up China here in a way that's uncomfortable for the Japanese, and it's really going to take some thinking about how they deal with that. Meanwhile, the UK just going hog wild in the Middle East, building 2 more military bases to supplement the factory they already have in Persia, and launching almost all of the planes, actually all the planes that were there, they built that one, but all the planes that were in Persia, yep, right there up into Moscow to reinforce what Russia, or what Chris calls the Save Russia strategy, which is apt because they kind of needed saving right about now. Down in the Mediterranean, we see that the Brits have, as expected, cleared out the Italian Navy that was dead anyway, so they made that move into Gibraltar last turn. And for the first time in the game, the Americans have actually started building and doing something in the Atlantic, building modestly a couple subs, a lone transport planes and such, activating Brazil as well. So we have a little bit that threatens to come into Europe on round 5. How will the Axis react? So halfway through turn 5, and the Axis are feeling the wrath, not so much of the allies, but of the dice. I mean, I know that's a familiar refrain for anybody who's losing a game of Axis, but I think Chris and I both agree that the rolling in this game has been particularly one-sided. We'll get to a few examples in just a minute, but the Axis have just had no luck lately. So you see Japan's just completed its turn. It used some air power to take out those American blockers that were left and dropped one of its own. So this took quite a bit of pondering. It actually took a day to think about this turn. Japan ended up leaving a healthy portion of its navy in Sea Zone 6 in order to continue to project around that sphere of influence, and then using what few land units were left to it. We first of all took back Manchuria, which I almost forgot to do, not realizing that was still in Chinese hands. Got down here, kind of reestablished the coastline, finally took Vietnam. So we've got some contiguous territory here. One example of bad rolling, so Kui Chau had 5 Chinese guys in it. The Japanese infantry, supported by Albus Air Force, managed to get, I think, 3 hits out of 5, and then 3 of those 5 twos hit back. So wiping out all the infantry, not able to take the territory. At least we cleared the units. So I mean, that's the type of bad roll that happens sometimes, but boy, it gets worse. So we've got Japan kind of spreading out now again. Not so much the Triangle of Doom, but at least we've got a line, a border here with Navy that we're starting to kind of protect our coastline in any event. Still a lot of work to do, but got that happening. On the Eastern Front here, here's where it gets ugly. So Germany and Russia have since taken a turn. And Germany, consistent with its strategy from the beginning of the game, used this opportunity to send all of its bombers and all of its planes that it's been building up. I think there are 4 planes and 8 bombers that went into Russia. You'll see there are 3. There are 3 bombers left now. That's how many got shot down with AAs. There are also quite a few planes taken out by interceptors, and no Russian and British planes taken out by the escorts. So that was just horrible rolling for the Axis. Managed to do some damage. I think we did 10 damage to this industrial complex. It's been since cleaned up. Russia's buying infantry now, clean up that damage, and purchasing a radar tower, one of our house rule units here. The nice little piece from Historical Board Gaming, I believe, isn't it, Chris?
Yep.
Yeah, historicalboardgaming.com. Fantastic resource. And of course, the radar tower intercepts, or rather, boosts the power of the interceptors up to a 2. So not only do they have more powerful interceptors, but there are more of them. With the British there, of course, we saw last turn the Americans having dropped those 6 planes in Yakut on their way to Russia. So it's just a happy plane party there in Moscow. In Novgorod up here, Germany bought itself 5 planes with all that money it was flush with. Why was it flush with money? Because one thing I neglected to mention at the end of the last video was Italy used its air power to come up here and knock out the one guy who was sitting in Rostov. So the Germans got to shoot a tank over, take Rostov and Volgograd. That Volgograd is a +5 IPC bonus. So that was a 9 IPC shot in the arm for Germany. Russia's since taken it back with its mechs. But that helped, and that money went towards planes. So we've got a line here, and that line is still good. If you combine these German land units, you'll get as many now as are in Moscow. So there's a bit of parity there. But you know, still some work to be done before any kind of damage can happen. The German Navy swung back over here to the upper Atlantic and dropped its load in Nenetsia to kind of get a little backup on that front. So with that in mind, there's a whole lot of Allied playing left to do on turn 5. So the beginning of turn 6 comes along pretty quickly from the last one, because the back half of turn 5 wasn't all that eventful. You see the U.S. fleet here reposition itself down to Hawaii with a blocker, having just taken out Japan's blocker for good measure. A little tit for tat, as it were. The Anzac Navy kind of inching upward here, waiting to do something. It's really hard to tell these stupid Anzac molds, but this is supposed to be a cruiser up here at top and a transport and 3 subs down at the bottom that were just built. Over here on the Calcutta China front, Calcutta is starting to be a little bit cautious of the fleet that's now within range, and the Air Force that's in striking distance, having built some ground units and pulled back some things, including a plane originally intended for Russia, came back to India for safekeeping. That's not to stop, however, the horde from marching its way up to Yunnan. and doing so cautiously. China actually didn't have any attacks, none that were involved rolling anyway, just built up in Szechuan. No doubt that stack, which is now pretty formidable in Szechuan, since China moves first, is going to join forces or do some ugly stuff here with the Brits next time around. So the Japanese had some breathing room this turn, but they're going to be sucking in that breath again pretty darn shortly. On this side of the board, we see the Brits on the European side just peppering the Middle East with infantry, really just because they can. More planes intended for Russia, no doubt. Some of these planes from Malta swinging over to Persia, making their way the long road up to Moscow. The Americans have finally done something in the Atlantic by taking Gibraltar rather handily. But you see only one sub having been built there in the Atlantic, so it's really kind of a slap in the Atlantic side, while the main force still gets put into the Pacific. The attention still being paid here in the Pacific. That's 6 new subs, what Chris and I like to call the infantry of the sea, and a destroyer, all coming to back up that Hawaiian fleet, giving the Axis team here much to think about as we roll into turn 6. Halfway through turn 6 now, and the Axis are certainly slowing in momentum, but not wholly on their heels. Japan has just finished its turn. We've got a blocker there blocking access to Sea Zone 6, and in the meantime, we've done what we can, scraping every last piece here to try and regroup, kind of strategically pull back a bit, if you will, in Asia, while at the same time is securing for itself as much IPC production as possible. So we've managed to upgrade our infrastructure along the Chinese coast there, get some production on the ground finally. We've had to pull back, unfortunately, from Hunan, which is just inevitable and sad and just kind of pathetic, really, that we had to build that airstrip and that military base, and now it's going to get overrun. But circumstances are what they are. Hopefully pulling back enough here so that we have a sufficient defensive force by the time the combined Chinese and Indian stack make it up into that region. In the meantime, we've scraped every last piece that we could to take these islands down here, the Money Islands all at once, along with Malaya, in an effort to boost Japanese production. So Japan's gone from, I think, 30 to something to 60 IPCs this turn. That'll be a nice little shot in the arm. Meanwhile, the Navy, hanging out here in the middle, basically, the last place it has left that it can really project power in every direction. So that helps against what is an accumulating Allied fleet over here in both Hawaii and down in Queensland. We really, unfortunately, lost the opportunity down here to slow down Anzac's progress a little bit. I threw a sub and those 2 planes and New Hebrides that just weren't able to do anything else at that little Navy. Of course, not to defeat it, but hopefully to whittle it down a little bit. Unfortunately, that combined effort scored a total of 1 hit, which all that did was damage the carrier that's then going to be repaired again on the next turn. So that accomplished absolutely nothing. On this side, the Germans, again, continuing their advance. You see they actually got tanks all the way here to Tunguska. You wouldn't know it now, though, because the Russians responded with an air and ground assault that took out the Germans in Novosibirsk and Tunguska. So there'll be no further advance on that side. So after some debate, the Germans threw another round of strategic bombing into Moscow. A lot more successful this time. That radar base, initially I had misremembered it boosting the defensive intercept capability of all these planes, but it only boosts 2. So it's actually not as powerful of a unit as it might otherwise be. But still, Russian forces and these combined Allied air fleet stripped off 5 planes from the incoming German Luftwaffe. So that whittled my planes down a bit. I still have 4 left, so that's not bad. Nothing got shot down otherwise with the AAs, except I think for one tack. So we're able to wipe out the radar tower, takes 6 damage, I think it is, and then we put 12 damage. So we're in that neighborhood, 12 or 14, I think it was actually 14 on the industrial complex. So Russia was able to clean that up and then build only 4 guys. So that is, that's an accomplishment for Germany, knocking Russia down to a production of 4 infantry. That said, it's still got another 30 just about in IPCs, 29, 30, and that stack now is on the move. Germany ended up pulling off a move to where it took Bryansk in the combats and then moved all the fast movers, the tanks and the mechs, down to Ukraine, because otherwise that Ukraine stack was vulnerable to the combined mech, tank, and air force that Russia could throw at it, and it would have got wiped out this turn. As it was, the Russians are certainly threatening what's there in Ukraine, and they know that if they can punch through Ukraine, then there's a soft underbelly of Germany that they can get to. But it's got to move that slow-moving stack in order to do it and leave them, further from Moscow every step they take. So it's risky for both sides, but there is finally some movement along that front in Russia, and a whole lot of turn 6 left for the Allies to capitalize on their advantage. Beginning of turn 7, the U.S. has committed itself to a southern Pacific strategy here, moving all of its Navy down to the Carolines, taking that, joining it with the Anzac Navy as well, with a backup of the subs and another transport coming. Back in the western U.S., we have the majority of the U.S. builds comprising 5 bombers. So the 6 subs that were there moved down to Hawaii. The bombers that were there moved to Midway. We've got planes down in Hawaii. There is no question that the U.S. is taking an offensive posture here in the Pacific, to be combined with the offense happening in Southeast Asia. We have Indian roundels on the board for the first time in a long time, while that stack continues its progress up in China, taking hold of that airstrip, eliminating the military base, and inching its way towards the Chinese coast, backed up by the Chinese stack, of course. Some of these tanks here peeled off to take these territories. Shan State had been in Japanese hands and took that away. So, cutting into the money, Anzac took one of the money islands just to knock that bonus down, but otherwise consolidating itself with the Americans. The Brits and the Americans here in the Mediterranean have finally completed the conquest of Africa, which, under the house rules, just like with grasshoppers, that constitutes a victory token. This time around, the Brits got the technology Blitz tactics, which increases the capacity of mechanized infantry. So none of these technologies are terrible, but for the UK, that's about the least damaging one they could have gotten from my Axis perspective. Italy has moved all of its planes over to Ukraine to back up the Germans, in keeping with my pre-existing plan. And we'll see what the Germans can do to take advantage of that on the next turn. Now halfway through turn 7, Japan's pushed back where they can. Russia had moved those guys over from Far East to Siberia here. We did a paratroop and bombing run to get rid of those. We've pulled back as much as we can afford to Sea Zone 6, built 2 new carriers, filled them up with planes, pulled what Navy that we could back, built up some infantry in these factories here, but otherwise just holding on where we can. So down here in the southeast, we decided to take the opportunity. Couldn't credibly take out the infantry there, although we seriously thought about it, but it would have cost so many planes that it would have left us too defenseless. So instead what we did was take out the Indian offensive capability, all except for one of these tanks. Push back there. We're able to regroup the other half of the Navy here in the Malaya Sea Zone, get back my Money Island bonuses so that I'm still at 56 in IPCs, which is still a respectable number. In Russia, Germany bought every plane that could get into Ukraine. So that's 3 new planes, landed every plane that it owned in Ukraine, and to join the Italian Air Force there, and managed to ward Russia off from that invasion. That was what I calculated a turn ago. That was going to be the only way to keep the Russians out of Ukraine. So they took the hint, they hightailed it back to Moscow, and since there were no planes left in Moscow, Germany's able to take another bombing run. So now we've got the air base and the radar base totally shut off. We did 11 points of damage to the IC. They repaired 4, or all but 4, I should say. So there's still 4 points of damage on that factory. So we're gaining in terms of the race to shut off their production. And that's always nice to see a series of flames coming out of Moscow. But not to get too heady, that is 38 infantry now in Moscow, and more artillery, more mechs than there used to be. The mobile units up here cleaned up the rest of the Nazi influence in central Russia. So it's still a one-front war now with these two, with the Brits coming up the Caucasus now to bring another line into the battle. Germans kind of descending into Italy because the Allies certainly continue to pose a threat there. Still plenty of advantage left for the Allies to press on the rest of turn 7. Reached the beginning of turn 8, and the hammer has fallen on Japan. That was a big old naval invasion with all of the bombers, not only from Midway, but also the 5 that were built in Western. And I'll be honest, I had overlooked those when I was planning my Japanese move, although honestly I don't know that it would have made much of a difference because Japan had dwindling options. But Japan chose not to scramble the 3 planes that were there on the ground in order to save some sort of air force for next move. But as a result, I mean, there was a 100% chance of winning. It was just whether I was going to get a few extra rounds of dice, and I debated that one. I still debate what was the best choice, but in any event, you knew you were going to win, and you knew you were going to have a whole crap ton of Navy here in Season 6, which we do. Been backed up, of course, by Kazakhstan. Not a lot that Japan can do to come back, but I mean, it's going to survive a bit longer anyway. Just, you know, not that much, because for one thing, you'll see the U.S. did some island hopping here with all those transports. Reason being that under our house rules, one of the victory tokens was taking all those islands, doing all that island hopping. So, which rewards some, you know, historically accurate behavior. And as a result, the U.S. got a tech roll, and they rolled, what did they roll? Long-range aircraft?
Long-range aircraft.
Long-range aircraft. So all their stuff gets to go 1 extra bit. So that's cool for them. You know, happy for them. Not really, but that's the Allies rolling on. We have Anzac continuing to build a pesky little navy, taking back my Money Islands. The Indians clearing out Southeast Asia, taking out all of the stuff Japan had on the land, even sending its air force to those excess tack bombers that had parked in Malta, or Malaya rather, and clearing that out for themselves so that this stack can continue to march toward the coast, which it's reached, and now bearing down on these factories which haven't been able to build as much as they should because we've been trying to defend the Japanese home islands in vain. So China resurgent almost to its full glory there. In the Middle East, we have just factories kicking up for the British. They've upgraded their military base in Iraq, continuing to march folks there. You got a huge stack now building up in northwest Persia, getting ready to supplement the Russians. And in the Mediterranean now, the slow death of Italy, actually not going to be that slow, with this sub little party here happening in Season 97, already strangling 7 of the only 12 IPCs that Italy still gets. Italy, so U.S. obviously invaded southern France, supplemented by some some British individuals there. Italy able to take those guys out with its bombers and mechs and such, but rolled poorly enough that it ultimately had to kill not only a plane, but all of the land units. And rather than taking out a bomber, which I just really didn't want to do, I allowed that to remain American for the time being, and will flip to German hands. So Germany's got a whole lot of responsibility left for itself to carry on the Axis cause here on turn 8. Halfway through turn 8, it's looking ugly for Japan. They weren't able to make a dent in this navy. They didn't try because they wouldn't have been able to. They were, however, able to wipe out the Air Force in the Soviet Far East, which included all the bombers, a plane from the U.S., as well as a attack bomber from Russia that came over to supplement. Those planes can't make it back, but the Strats did, so that's something. In the factory, we were able to build and bring some planes up to reinforce there, make kind of one last gasp at holding that factory, but, you know, its time is short. With no land units left in Southeast Asia, it's just a matter of time until all this gets gobbled up. We're able to take out one transport, so that's something. But otherwise, we're just kind of doing a death dance here in Japan, holding on as long as possible. The fleet that was in Malaya with no units to transport, doing a pretty pathetic retreat here to the Indian Ocean. What are you going to do? On the German side, Germany's buying all tanks at this point and lining them up thusly. Did another strat bomb run, which this time was really productive. So he peeled off 5 of my planes with those interceptors, even though I had more planes than he had at this point. Was still able to peel off 5 of mine, or 4 of mine, I think, and I only hit 1 of his. So consistent with the pathetic roll-in the Axis has consistently had this game. I think we both said the Axis has rolled more poorly than any country ever has in the history of the game, which is pretty accurate. Germany coming in and taking in South France. So how will the Allies continue to press their advantage on round 8?